the early hours of July 7, 1985, 34-year-old Jane Hilton was found beaten and stabbed to death. Her body was discovered in a bedroom at her employer's home, a place she had moved into just the day before, seeking refuge from a troubled marriage. Jane was found by two housemates and her daughter, Autumn. The murder was baffling, and the case remained unsolved for 14 years until two new detectives reopened it in 1999. A misquote in an article led investigators to focus on Ricky Davis as a suspect. Davis was eventually tried, convicted of the crime, and maintained his innocence throughout. Relentless in his fight, he turned to the very justice system that had imprisoned him. After 15 years, Davis was exonerated, and the true killer was identified through genetic genealogy testing and the efforts of the Innocence Project, a group committed to uncovering the truth. Jane was well known in El Dorado Hills, California, where she worked as a columnist for Foothill Times. She frequently covered social events around town for the paper. Jane was a mother of 6, whom she cherished and inspired daily through her poetry. She had been working toward her real estate license and married Archie Hilton in 1984. However, by July 1985, their marriage began to unravel. It was then that she sought help from her employer, Wilma Klein. Klein owned a fairly large home in El Dorado Hills. With her lived her daughter, Maureen Klein, and her boyfriend, Wilma's grandson, Ricky Davis, and his girlfriend, Connie Dahl, also occupied a room at the house. On July 6, 1985, Wilma welcomed Jane and her youngest daughter, 13-year-old Autumn Anchor, into her home. By all accounts, it was a full house. The first night of her new life would prove to be the night her life ended. At 3:30 a.m., Ricky Davis, then 20, and his girlfriend, 19-year-old Connie Dahl, returned from a party to find Autumn lingering about outside. She told them she was out late and afraid her mother was going to be angry. All three made their way into the house. There was blood in the hallway. It was silent as they reached the first room, belonging to Maureen, Ricky's mother. On the bed was the bloody body of Jane Hilton. She was not breathing. Maureen and her boyfriend had gone on a camping trip and were not home at the time. Ricky and Connie called 911, and police arrived, but Jane was pronounced dead at the scene. She had suffered 29 stab wounds, was beaten, and bitten on her shoulder. It was a senseless murder, and investigators began to interview those closest to Jane. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe to our new channel, where we uncover captivating and chilling cold cases that will keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss the twists and turns we have in store. Let's continue. Archie Hilton, Jane's estranged husband, was interviewed and provided detectives with a solid alibi and DNA. Archie had been the logical choice as he and Jane had been going through a rough patch. He, however, said that the marriage was snowed over and that there was no trouble between them. He was cleared and all leaves went cold. Ricky Davis and Connie Dahl both told investigators they arrived home in the early morning hours and found Autumn waiting outside. When they entered the house, they found the hallway carpet bloody. The blood trail led them to the master bedroom where they found Jane lying dead on the bloodied mattress. They speculated that an intruder may have been responsible for the murder. For 14 years, the case remained unsolved. The cold case reopened in 1999. El Dorado County Sheriff's detectives Richard Strasser and Rick Fitzgerald retest with the investigation. After poring over paperwork, they zoomed in on a news article. Connie Dahl, former girlfriend of Ricky Davis and housemate Jane Hilton, had given an interview to a reporter. She was quoted saying Hilton's body was lying in bed like someone placed her there in the position she would normally sleep in. This statement seemed to contradict a muffled audio recording of a statement that Davis had previously made. Detective Fitzgerald falsely thought he heard him say the body was found on the floor. Dahl was, at the time, serving a jail sentence in Oregon on unrelated charges. Detectives brought her in for an interview and began a 3-hour-long interrogation. Initially, Dahl stuck to her original story. Over the next 18 months, though, she would be interrogated 4 times. Detectives were found to have used techniques known to increase the chances of a false confession. Dahl was systematically forced into incriminating Davis and Jane's daughter Autumn in the murder. Dahl was threatened with a charge of murder. If she cooperated, though, she'd be given a lenient sentence of manslaughter and serve only a year. Detectives Strasser and Fitzgerald told Dahl that DNA evidence was going to be used to trace the suspect. In truth, no DNA evidence was brought into the case during that period. In truth, testing had not been done on the DNA recovered from the scene. By showing a crime scene photos and using facts from the crime, such as the bike mark on Jane's shoulder, investigators sped Dahl the information they wanted to hear. Over the course of the 4 interviews, Dahl was starting to break. She began remembering facts from the crowd. This in turn allowed her to fabricate and create an entirely different account of events from the night of the murder. In one interview, Dahl said that Autumn was present during the murder of Jane and was sprayed with blood. In another, she confessed that she was probably the person that fit Jane on the shoulder. Dahl would say that the murder began with an argument between Davis and Jane. She alleged that Davis wanted Autumn to join them at a party. When Jane refused, Davis erupted in a fit of anger, leading to the death of Jane. Her story kept changing to fit the facts being fed. However, she couldn't remember the weapon used for the murder or where it was eventually hidden. Dahl had implicated her ex-boyfriend Davis in the murder of Jane Hilton. He was now the prime suspect. Ricky Davis and Autumn Anker were also interviewed following the confession of Connie Dahl. Both Davis and Anker stuck to their original accounts of the crime. Detectives again lied to Davis, telling him that Anker had also implicated him in the murder. Anker told detectives she had no reason to protect Davis when they threatened her with culpability regarding the murder. Despite their interrogation techniques, detectives could not sway Davis or Anker to change their stories. They therefore used the confession of Dahl to arrest Davis. Dahl was offered a plea bargain to testify against Davis at his trial. Davis's first trial was declared a mistrial by jurors. His second, in February 2005, would eventually convict him. Dahl took the stand and testified against Davis. She told the court of how she struggled with Jane, and she herself accidentally bit the victim on the shoulder. She went on to say that she went outside as Davis continued the bloody assault on Hilton. Dahl said she could hear screaming, pleading, and gurgling as Davis continued the brutal attack. Based entirely on the testimony of Dahl's account of events, Davis was sentenced to 16 years in prison for the second-degree murder of Jane Hilton. Dahl received a lesser charge of manslaughter and received a year-long sentence at the county jail. Dahl, though, would eventually die from a drug overdose in February 2014. Meanwhile, Davis was not going down without a fight. He maintained his innocence and, in February 2006, made contact with the Northern California Innocence Project. He asked if they could help him prove that he was wrongly convicted. The NCIP was founded in February 2001 by Kathleen Rodolphi and Linda Starr. The project began after legislation offered convicted inmates to seek DNA testing to prove their innocence. It's a non-profit clinical program of Santa Clara University School of Law. After Davis made contact with the NCIP in February 2006, his case was put through a thorough re-examination. Cooperation between the NCIP and the El Turotar County District Attorney's Office allowed for the DNA recovered from the crime scene to be retested post-conviction. Evidence from the crime scene included Hilton's nightgown and biological material found under her fingernails. The results revealed an unknown male DNA profile. DNA from Hilton's fingernails and neck gown were both found to be from the same source. Test results eliminated Davis, Dahl, and Anker. This proved Dahl's testimony was contradictory to the physical evidence and therefore had to have been fabricated. The DNA also proved Archie Hilton innocent. Unfortunately, he had passed away by the time results were released. The DNA profile file was entered into the FBI Combined Index DNA System, CODIS, but no matches were found. Although the evidence seemed to prove Davis's consistent claim of innocence correct, there were some hurdles that still needed to be jumped. The NCIP successfully argued that had the DNA results been presented to the jury during Davis's trial, the outcome would be different. However, until January 2017, the California standard required that new evidence quite unerringly to innocence. It was considered an almost unattainable standard. In February 2015, a false confession expert, Richard Leo, reviewed transcripts of Dahl's interrogations. Leo concluded that the methods used by detectives during the interrogation of Dahl were designed to pressure and persuade Dahl to a doctrine account that matched the detectives' pre-existing beliefs about how and why the murder of Jane Hilton occurred. In February 2016, though, the NCIP co-sponsored Senate Bill 1134. This bill allowed wrongfully convicted inmates like Davis to prove that new evidence would likely have been compelling to a jury. NCIP attorney Melissa O'Connell filed a petition for a new trial based on the new DNA evidence testing. Championed by former California State Senator Mark Leno, the bill was passed in January 2017, putting California's standard in line with bound of 43 other states. In February 2019, Superior Court Judge Kenneth Malakian vacated Davis's 2005 conviction and ordered a new trial. Initially set to start in February, however, the judge announced the trial would take place in April 2020, citing for defense attorneys' health as the catalyst for change in date. However, the fate of the trial was about to change once again. Advancements in DNA testing led to Davis becoming the first convicted person in California and the second in the United States to be exonerated for a crime. Genetic genealogy is a fairly new DNA testing concept. It involves taking DNA evidence from a crime scene and sending them to genetic companies. These companies then search boundary tree databases to find a potential match. In February 2020, DNA evidence matched to a man considered an unlikely suspect. El Dorado County Attorney Vern Pearson announced in February 2020 that a new suspect had been identified as the man linked to the DNA evidence found on Jane Hilton's body. Following the arrest, many people spoke to the media about the man they knew as Michael Green. Green was a longtime resident of Roseville, California. He graduated from Oakmount High School in 1986. He was described as an easygoing, kind person, even-tempered, and even super chill. One classmate who wanted to remain anonymous could not understand why Green would go to El Dorado Hills and brutally murder a woman. According to reports, Green was 17 years old at the time of Hilton's murder. On the night of July 6, 1985, the victim's daughter, Autumn, met Green and two of his friends, Calvin and Stephen. They hung out together at the park when Autumn decided to go home and have a shower before returning. Allegedly, Autumn told her mother she was going to another friend's house for the evening. Instead, she returned to the park to join the boys. What happened next is pure speculation. Investigators believe that during this time, Green broke into the house and was confronted by Jane. In a struggle to get away, Green may have attacked her in a frenzy. Following the attack, Jane's body was discovered by Davis, Dahl, and Otto when they returned home. Green had no criminal convictions either before or after the murder. It seems he'd led a normal life until DNA linked him to the gruesome crime. The other two boys who were with Green were tracked down shortly after his arrest. Kelvin, unfortunately, had died some time ago. Stephen, however, was found and interviewed the day after the arrest. He was being treated as a witness and not a participant. Green was arrested on February 11, 2020. Since Green was a teenager at the time of the murder, he made his first appearance at the juvenile court on February 19, 2020. District Attorney Vern Pearson said that procedurally, the court has to go through some steps on the juvenile side of it. Following this, Green was granted a transfer so that he could be tried as an adult. He waited 2.5 years before he would be tried in court. Green pleaded no contest on July 29, 2022. This plea means Green gave up his right to a jury trial. A jury trial meant he was to face a charge of first-degree murder. He also gave up his chance to challenge the plea or the consequences of his decision. His sentencing date was set for September 27, 2022 to be presided over by Judge Suzanne Kingsbury. At sentencing, Dr. Elizabeth Kaufman, a professor in psychological science education, was called in on educational capacity to explain to the court the development of a dependolescent. Kaufman's research explained the varying development needs of adolescents with regard to emotional and cognitive development. The late adolescent stage allowed an individual to understand right from wrong, yet at the same time they're also functioning under diminished capacity for impulse control. The defense called several witnesses from Green's childhood, some who even maintained relationships with him into adulthood. Each witness was asked if their opinion had changed of him since the knowledge of his confession. All witnesses agreed they'd been shocked to discover that he was responsible for the murder of Hilton. Individuals who knew him in varying capacities described him as jovial, popular, funny, and loving. These words were used to describe him before and after the murder. Green's ex-wife, Karen Green, said, "There's just not a bad bone in Myth." After witness statements were given, each of Jane Hilton's children presented their victim impact statements. They all described the unforgivable loss that Green inflicted upon their family. "The why it happened and how different my life could have been will haunt me forever," said Heather Purvis McConnell, one of James' daughters. Argeth Brandon, Hilton's fourth child, said, "I loved my mother and I assume Michael loves his mother too. I want to know what he would feel or what he would say to the person who stabbed your mother 29 times. What would you do if you received an early morning call to tell you your mother is dead?" The court listened to her description of the feeling of gathering her mother's belongings from the house in which she was killed. Ardith finished with a powerful declaration. "We will always have something in common, regretting the stupid decision you made 37 years ago." Hilton's son, Ian, echoed his sister's sentiments. He went on to explain the uncertainty the family faced and the recurring nightmares they suffered, especially after the crooked finger of Bling was pointed at his own sister, Autumn. He broke down in tears as he ended with an almost inaudible remark. "All the words we say will never bring my mother back." Autumn was the last to speak. Her statement showed true agony as she recounted the cloud of suspicion she'd lived under for the last 2 decades. Recounting the day 2 crew cup thick mustache detectives came into her house telling her they found the people responsible for her mother's death. She was then repeatedly accused of biting her mother and helping move her body from the floor to the bed. Autumn went on to say that if she hadn't said the word lawyer at that point, she did not know how much further the intimidation tactics of the investigators could have gone. Afterwards, Deputy District Attorney Jay Linden read a statement on behalf of the family. In the statement, he asked Green what made him end Jane's life in such a brutal manner. "You beat her. She had numerous wounds around her head and face. By your own words, you kicked her jaw. You bit her on the shoulder. Why was that?" Linden continued to read the statement that expressed how Green didn't just murder Jane. He destroyed numerous lives in the process. Linden then asked Green if he'd given any thought about Jane and who she was. He pointed out her achievements and the love she had for each of her children. In closing arguments, Margaret Husher, Green's defense attorney, stressed the idea that he was unable to stop himself. She emphasized that he did not know what he was doing was wrong, as he was an adolescent at the time. This argument was based on the testimony of expert witness, Dr. Kaufman. She asked that the court show mercy as she read off the multiple penal codes and rules of the court. Judge Kingsbury interjected by saying, "The court is not going to put him on probation," effectively ending any further comment from the defense. In response, Linden thanked the court and said the application for probation was offensive. He said, "It was a smack to this family who had endured this proceedings." Linden stated that he already got away with murder for 37 years. Placing him on probation allowed him to get away with more. Judge Kingsbury said she had heard a multitude of arguments about murder cases surrounding adolescent development. She remarked that after her 26 years on the bench, Jane Hilton's murder was by far the most brutal. Before passing her sentence, Kingsbury asked the family for their forgiveness for the trauma they had suffered, although she was not originally assigned the case. She also hoped they would heal from the pain as it would have been their mother's wish. Kingsbury then encouraged Green to use all resources at his disposal in the California Department of Rehabilitation. "You're the key to the questions these people have. Doing that could ultimately help you with your outcome as it relates to parole," said Kingsbury. In closing, Kingsbury pointed out that she had heard from his friends that there's a great side to him and that he has much to offer. She also said he was young enough to be released and live a productive life. Green was sentenced to 15 years to life and remained it to the El Dorado County Jail. He will then be transferred to the California Department of Rehabilitation. Restitution will be decided after further consideration by the court. Davis was released on February 13, 2020 and planned to celebrate over pizza with his family. His lawyer, Melissa O'Connell, said he will be entitled to more than $750,000 in state compensation for the wrongful conviction. Although the amount was high enough for him to re-enter society and start afresh, O'Connell said it could not make up for the years of freedom that he lost. Davis went on to sue the state for damages covering the period from May 21, 2002 to February 13, 2020 for a whopping $18 million. The lawsuit names El Dorado County as well as former detectives Richard Strasser, Rick Fitzgerald, Bill Wilson, who's deceased and been sued through his estate, and Larry Hennig. Sheriff's Office pathologist Dr. Robert Anthony has also been included in the complaint. A Village Life newspaper reported that Davis was homeless after being released. The lawsuit is still pending as of 2022. In September 2022, California passed Assembly Bill 2644. This bill would, commencing January 1, 2024, prohibit law enforcement officers from employing threats, physical harm, deception, or psychological manipulative interrogation tactics as specified during a custodial interrogation of a person 17 years of age or younger. The bill faced opposition, but District Attorney Van Pearson is urging all law enforcement to stop using intimidation tactics. Pearson stated that 10 years ago, he would have viewed the methods used to get a confession differently. However, after seeing the true impact it can have, he believed there is room for change. This also comes after research points to deceptive tactics being used for years by law enforcement that will presume guilt and focus on getting a confession rather than getting the full story. The district attorney is implementing this new policy in his office and is urging other district attorneys to do the same. El Dorado County DA's primary evidence is a confession obtained using threats, lies, or psychological manipulation interrogation tactics. These measures are to ensure that no one is ever again convicted based on a coerced false confession like the case of Ricky Davis. Pearson personally apologized to all involved in the miscarriage of justice caused by the tactics used by Ben investigators into the brutal 1985 murder of Jane Hilton. After 37 years, the right man is finally facing justice. Yet the lives of so many were left broken by mistakes and false accusations. For Jane Hilton's family, hopefully, they can now pick up the pieces after being divided over the innocence of their own sister, Autumn. Ricky Davis can never regain the liberty he lost, and Michael Green destroyed not only the lives of the victim's family and friends, but the lives that he touched in the years before and after the murder. What are your thoughts on today's case? Did Michael Green deserve the sentence he received? Does his clean record, minus the murder, make him innocent of intentional murder? How could he let an innocent man take the blame for his actions? Can Ricky Davis ever get his life back on track even when he does receive compensation? And why is it taking so long? The case of Matthew Winkler, Secrets of a Religious Family. Sometimes the most horrible and unpredictable crimes are committed in seemingly perfect families. Of course, even in the most prosperous unit of society can come crisis, which will be unnoticed by others, but literally poison the lives of all members of the family and eventually lead to tragedy. The Winklers, in the town of Selmer, were considered by many to be a model family. The young pastor, his wife, and their 3 daughters looked happy, had everything they needed for a comfortable life, were healthy and successful, but in a quiet pool, as they say. In this case, many questions remained unanswered because we heard only one version of what happened. And the story itself became the subject of the book, Sex and Murder, Secrets of a Pastor. March 22, 2006, the small town of Selmer, Tennessee shook the terrible news. A 31-year-old pastor named Matthew Winkler was brutally murdered in his own home, and his wife Mary and their 3 daughters, 8-year-old Patricia, 6-year-old Maria Eliza, and 1-year-old Brianna disappeared without a trace. That day, the preacher of the Church of Christ did not show up for the evening service where he was supposed to attend with his family. This circumstance seemed strange and suspicious because Matthew was always very responsible and could not miss the planned event without informing anyone. None of the family members also answered the phone, which was even more disturbing. Alarmed community members decided to go to the Winklers' residence to find out what had happened and if they needed help. From the outside, the house looked normal. The windows and doors were intact, and nothing suspicious was visible. Inside, there were lights on in several rooms, and they could hear a television playing quite loudly in one of the rooms. It gave the impression that the owners of the house were busy doing their own thing. The front door was locked, but no one answered the knock. Phone calls also went unanswered, and through the curtained windows, it was impossible to see what was going on inside or if anyone was there. However, even though the whole situation was quite strange, no one was in a hurry to call the police. Instead, a call was made to an elder of the religious community who advised them to look for a spare key and open the door themselves. It took another hour and a half, and when members of the community were finally able to get inside the house, they found an eerie scene. Everything in the house was in its place. There was no sign of intruders, but the owners were nowhere to be seen either. Everything seemed normal until the visitors looked into the marital bedroom. There on the floor, in a pool of his own blood, lay the pastor's body. There was a huge hole in his back from a gunshot wound. Blood spattered everywhere, and bloody foam dried on his face. By then, the body had already cooled and stiffened. It was obvious that Matthew had been lying there for many hours and had probably been killed in the morning because he was dressed in his pajamas. It was only after this that a call was made to the police. By the time the police arrived, a whole crowd of neighbors, churchgoers, and casual passersby had gathered in and around the house, interested in what was going on. All of these people had left their fingerprints at the crime scene. They left their fingerprints and shoe prints, erased or trampled possible evidence, greatly complicating the work of investigators. The police took the body for forensic examination and found that the pastor was killed by a single shot in the back fired from a large caliber weapon. He died a few minutes after the wound from massive blood loss, unable to call for help. It was simply impossible to establish definitively whether there were any strangers in the house at that time because the people who had arrived before the police arrived had literally destroyed all traces of them. The picture of the crime was quite strange, and those who could shed any light on what happened disappeared. The fate of the wife and daughters of the murdered man remained unknown. The police assumed that the woman and children could have been kidnapped or also killed. By the way, the family minivan Winklers also disappeared from the garage. A massive search was launched and the state issued a yellow alert. This meant that children were missing and all citizens were asked to be vigilant and assist in the search. But let's break this whole story down from the beginning. Matthew Brian Winkler was born in 1974, November 21st, in the picturesque country town of Henderson, Tennessee, and was the youngest of 3 sons of Dan and Diane Winkler. Our hero and his 2 older brothers, James and Daniel, grew up in a rather conservative Christian family. Their parents were very religious and brought up their sons in strictness and obedience. It is worth noting that Matthew became a minister of the church in the 5th generation. His father, great-uncle Michael, grandfather Wendell, great-grandfather Merlin Winkler, and great-great-grandfather Merlin Paul Winkler Sr. were all preachers of the gospel at one time. The father, to top it all off, ran the local preacher's school and was a man respected and influential in his hometown. In their younger years, the Winkler brothers attended Sunday school and were active in church activities. In addition, Matthew in high school was seriously interested in soccer, and everyone who saw his game on the field noted that he had talent, and he could well become an outstanding athlete of world renown. However, later, the young man decided to sacrifice a promising sports career in favor of Bible study and church ministry. Since the preaching activity of the head of the family was associated with frequent travel, his wife and children almost always followed him. Because of this, Matthew changed several schools in his childhood, but the active, communicative, and friendly child quickly made friends and gained authority everywhere. When the boy finished school, his family lived in a small city called Austin, located in the state of Texas. Matthew was a creative person, had a powerful charisma, but here are some outstanding achievements in studies could not boast. After graduating from high school, he entered the college Freed-Hardeman and successfully completed it. In parallel, the young man began to try his hand as a pastor under the careful guidance of his father. Matthew was the youth minister of the Central Church of Christ in the city of McMinnville. He was later appointed to the preaching position at the 4th Street Church of Christ in Selmer, Tennessee. Mary Carol Winkler, maiden name Freeman, was born in December 1973 in Geist Township, Tennessee, and was the oldest of 2 daughters to her parents. She was also raised in a deeply religious family with strict rules. The head of the family for many years served as a pastor in the Christian church where the girl attended Sunday school. A few years later, a second daughter was born to the family and named Patricia. Unfortunately, the girl was born prematurely and had a number of serious health problems, including cerebral palsy, encephalitis, epilepsy, and mental retardation. For many years, the parents did not want to put up with the disappointing diagnoses of the child and desperately tried to treat her, agreeing even to experimental therapy. However, it did not bring any particular improvement. Mary tenderly loved her little sister, always treated her with awe and cared for her as best she could. But in 1987, when 10-year-old Patricia was bathing in the bathtub, her older sister was only a minute away to take something from the bathing accessories. And at that very moment, the girl had another epileptic seizure. When Mary returned to the room, her sister was no longer breathing and all attempts to resuscitate her had come to nothing. For a 13-year-old girl, it was a huge shock and the first loss in her life. She blamed herself for the tragedy and was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Teachers who saw the deplorable state of Mary sent her to the school psychologist, working with whom she helped. But her father, learning about what was happening, made a scandal and forbade his daughter to go to these sessions, saying that such problems are discussed only within the family. In fact, the girl never received real moral support from her parents. Mary grew up modest and quite shy. She tried to avoid any conflicts, and after the tragic death of her little sister, she became withdrawn. Since her father did not allow her to seek help from a specialist, the trauma over the years has resulted in serious psychological problems. After the death of Patricia, the parents decided to adopt a little girl named Charlotte, who was from a dysfunctional large family. Soon, the couple was also allowed to take custody of Charlotte's 2 brothers and sister, so the family was reunited in their new home. Mary was once again the older sister and took care of the younger children while helping her mother, Matthew and Mary Winkler, family life. The future spouses met soon after Matthew graduated from high school. The guy was prominent, handsome, athletic, and enjoyed great popularity with the opposite sex. But to spin novels right and left, he did not allow a strict religious upbringing. The young people immediately developed a liking for each other, which quickly grew into love. For both of them, it was the first strong feeling in their lives. And after a couple of months, they met each other's parents and, having received their blessing, began to plan a wedding. In April 1994, the lovers got married. When the family had an older daughter, Patricia, the head of the family was still in college and was forced to leave school for a while. He took a job at a construction site, but long there did not last because he was not used to hard physical labor. During this period, for the first time, made himself aware of the difficult character of Matthew. He was often angry with others, irritated at small things, and sometimes he could not control his anger. But Mary tried not to complain and not to tell anyone about what was happening in her family. A meek young woman brought up in the spirit of patriarchy, obeyed her husband in everything. At first, the Winklers lived near the house of Mary's parents, so she was able to see them regularly. But soon, Mrs. Freeman was diagnosed with cancer, which rapidly progressed. And in just a few months, she literally burned from the disease. It was another shock for Mary, and the care of her underage siblings now fell on her shoulders. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Mary was pregnant again at that time. But soon after the birth of their second daughter, the family moved to another city where they bought their own small house. After the move, Mary was completely absorbed in the care of the baby and almost stopped communicating with her father, as well as with younger brothers and sisters who were too demanding and constantly needed attention. In addition, the young mother began to suffer from severe postpartum depression. Everyone who was closely acquainted with the family Winkler noted some oddities in the character and behavior of Mary. The young woman was characterized as an introvert and even sociophobic. She did not communicate with anyone. It was difficult for her to make new acquaintances, much less friendships. She suffered from mood swings, was prone to melancholy, and any little thing could bring her to tears. While Matthew was building his career as a pastor, his wife became increasingly withdrawn. The situation became even more complicated when Mary once again became pregnant. and a few months later, she learned that the fetus had died in her womb. Such news strongly shook Mary, who was looking forward to the appearance of this child and very much dreamed of a large, friendly family. Again, to see the long-awaited 2 stripes on the pregnancy test, she could only 2 years later, and her happiness was unbounded. This time, Mary hid her pregnancy for a long time as if afraid of something. She did so until her situation became obvious. Once again, everyone began to talk about Mary's strange behavior and pathological reticence. The strange behavior of Mrs. Winkler was associated not only with a severe psychological trauma she suffered in childhood, but also with a very unhealthy environment within her own family, which only undermined her already unstable nervous system. The head of the family was a man of authority and demanded unconditional obedience. Despite the fact that in public, the Winklers looked like an ideal married couple where there is trust, mutual respect, and harmony, in reality, their neighbors have repeatedly heard how the husband shouted and snapped at his wife for no apparent reason. No one could even imagine that a respected pastor could raise a hand on his wife until one day Mary had a huge black eye. Despite the fact that she denied the fact of domestic violence and said that it was an accident, the city quickly spread rumors about the cruelty of a young preacher who beats the mother of his children. In addition, Matthew at some point developed an irresistible urge to experiment in bed. He offered his wife to diversify their intimate life with role-playing games, adult toys, and so on. But for Mary, brought up in strictness with conservative views, such was unacceptable. She strongly restricted her husband in this, which infuriated him, and he repeatedly tried to get what he wanted by force. One day, after another abuse in bed, Mary called her only close friend in tears and complained to her about the situation. The friend, who promised to keep her secret, immediately blobbed about everything, which provoked a new wave of rumors and gossip about the unacceptable behavior of the clergyman. At that time, Matthew was up for promotion and aspired to be a local church leader, but he was rejected because of rapidly spreading unpleasant rumors about him. Moreover, he was also removed from his position in the Sunday school, where he had brought God's word to the children and was in good standing. This was requested by the parents, who had also heard about the pastor's peculiar predilections. All this forced the family to leave their residence and move to another city where they planned to start over. They settled in Selmer, where they quickly gained the love and respect of those around them. Matthew took a job as a church pastor again, and his wife found a part-time job to make a small contribution to the family income. And although the family was still not smooth, their neighbors, as well as the congregation of the church where Matthew preached, considered Mary and Matthew an ideal couple and their family a model. Next door to the Winkler family lived a young married couple with whom the couple quickly became friends. They often visited each other, celebrated holidays together, shared news and secrets. A few months before the tragedy, during a joint dinner at the pastor's house, Mary bragged to the neighbors that her husband had bought her a gun for self-defense and had already taken her to the shooting range several times to learn how to handle it confidently. Mary turned out to be quite a capable student, quickly mastered all the subtleties, and accurately shot at targets. Moreover, it turned out that the Winklers already had firearms in the house, which had been purchased by the pastor earlier, also for self-defense. The guests wondered why the pastor and his wife needed all this because they live in a quiet town where they have no enemies, and everyone around them loves and respects their family. After another move of the couple, their financial situation left much to be desired. Mary was in search of various part-time jobs, and she also decided to get a medical degree to get a job in a clinic and help sick children. Soon, Mary decided to improve the financial condition of their family through financial fraud. She herself later claimed that she did not realize that she was doing something illegal and was going to pay back all the money as soon as she got back on her feet. What Mary was doing is commonly referred to as artificially inflating account balances. Mrs. Winkler also received checks from unspecified sources and then deposited them into a bank account she and her husband owned. She then changed the address of the account so that all communications would be routed there. The total amount of checks she received was almost $17,000, which aroused certain suspicions of the bank employees who decided to invite the couple to the office branch to clarify the circumstances and resolve the situation. But the pastor and his wife never showed up at the bank, and this aroused even more suspicion. It was assumed that Matthew was not aware of what his wife was doing at all. However, after Matthew's death, his wife tried to prove in court that the whole story of fraud was his idea, and that it was he who forced her to make dubious transactions while he himself remained in the shadows without arousing suspicion. Where has Mary disappeared to? When Mr. Winkler was found murdered in his own home, his wife and daughters were put on the wanted list, fearing that they too might be in mortal danger. Initially, the meek, shy, and homely Mary was initially viewed solely as a possible victim of the crime. However, after talking to neighbors and receiving information from the bank about financial fraud, she became the main suspect in the murder of her own husband. It was necessary to find out as soon as possible where Mary had disappeared to, where the children were, and if they were all right. They, as well as their family car, were put on the wanted list. Attempts were also made to trace transactions made from Mary's bank card and to locate her location through her cell phone signal. Mary was found just a day later in an Alabama resort town where she and her children were having fun at a local amusement park. It was as if the mother wanted to give her children one last party, realizing that she would soon be going to prison and would see her girls very soon. When the family was taken to the police station to testify, the two older daughters confidently told the same story. According to them, intruders broke into the house and injured their dad, and their mom picked up a gun to protect them. They were then forced to run for their lives. According to the girls, their father was alive and in the hospital, and they were soon to go and see him and return home. What exactly happened in the house, as it turned out, Patricia and Maria Eliza did not see and learned about the events from the words of their mother. They only heard a gunshot and glimpsed their father lying on the floor, and then their mother put them in the car and they drove away. Mary almost immediately began to confess, but she claimed that she could not reconstruct the entire chain of events of that day, referring to the temporary blur. According to her, her spouse had abused her for years, humiliating her and inducing her to forms of intimacy that were unacceptable to her. Mary insisted that it was he who had initiated the financial scam she had perpetrated. Matthew demanded total obedience, easily lost his temper, and once gave the will of his fists. This was confirmed by Matthew's secretary at his previous place of employment. The woman repeatedly witnessed how the pastor insulted his wife, who carefully brought him lunch to church, but he was always dissatisfied with something. The evening before the tragedy, there was another scandal in the family because of which the spouses went to bed in separate rooms. Mary cried all night, and in the morning, she did not realize how in her hands was a shotgun, which her husband kept loaded. She entered Matthew's room and shot him in the back while he was still lying in bed. Matthew collapsed to the floor, bloody foam oozing from his mouth and nose. According to Mary, her husband, while still alive, whispered, "Why?" To which she replied, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Mary then took her daughters and left the house. And her husband, as experts have established, tried to reach for the phone to call for help, but he no longer had the strength to do so. By the way, the weapon of crime was found in the trunk of the car on which Mary left with the children. For what purpose she took it with her, Mrs. Winkler also could not answer. At the trial, the role-playing costumes found in their home were presented as evidence of the pastor's humiliation and moral abuse of his wife. Upon seeing them, Mary turned pale and then became hysterical. Despite the fact that she confused her testimony and told several different versions of what happened, the court agreed that she was the victim of a domestic tyrant, and the murder was the result of years of anger, resentment, and pain. However, this did not absolve Mary of responsibility for what she had done. In April 2007, the court delivered its final verdict in this complicated and confusing case. Mrs. Winkler was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, but her mental state raised many questions. It was originally expected that the young woman would be sent to prison for at least 6 years. But in the end, she was given a sentence of less than 1 year. She spent 2 months of that sentence in a psychiatric hospital where experts were trying to determine whether she could regain custody of her children upon release. In the February, Mary was given sole custody of her daughters, who all this time lived with their paternal grandparents. Matthew's parents were extremely upset by this circumstance. They believed that their daughter-in-law had deliberately killed their son and suffered virtually no punishment for it. and now their granddaughters were given full custody of her. However, all their numerous attempts to file appeals had failed. As for the fraud case, it never went to trial. The bank never filed formal charges, and the whole story was dropped. The case of Siobhan McLaughlin. On February 28, 2006, McLaughlin was found deceased in a locked bedroom at her residence in Knockanishi Goldstown, Dublin 14. At first, it appeared as if she had tragically taken her own life. But within hours, the members of the McLaughlin family were convinced that she had been brutally murdered. Siobhan was one of 8 children, 7 girls and 1 boy, born to her parents, Oon and Deja McLaughlin. Siobhan worked as a chef in the canteen of an electrical firm. In 1989, at the age of 21, she met a man named Brian Carney, who was 31 years old. Brian worked as an electrical engineer for the same firm, which was a very good job. Siobhan lived in an apartment, while Brian lived with his toddler daughter, Aisling, from a previous relationship. Brian's wife and the mother of his child had passed away from natural causes a few years before Siobhan and him met. Brian was raising his daughter alone. Eventually, Siobhan would move in with Brian and his daughter. They renovated this house and then decided to sell it. Siobhan decided to set up her own catering business as she had trained at the Shelburne Hotel, and she was ahead of her time when it came to food. She used ingredients that were uncommon in Ireland during the 90s, but would now be considered standard. The era of meat and potatoes had passed. Brian was not only an electrical engineer, but he also owned a music shop called Music City, which he sold in February 2005. In 1995, the couple got engaged but then split up. They did keep in touch with each other over the years, meeting for dinner every few months. While they were separated, Brian never entered into any other relationship, and eventually they reconciled. In January 2002, they got married, and Shelburne was expecting a baby. Their son, Daniel, was born 6 months later. That same year, Brian and Shelburne traveled to Spain on holidays with the prospect of buying a boat. But while there, they came across a 200-year-old merchant's mansion on the island of Majorca in Spain. They bought it and converted it into a boutique hotel. It had 6 luxury bedrooms and a heated outdoor pool. The couple bought the property for €2.5 million and oversaw most of the renovations themselves. Siobhan was a visionary, traveling from place to place, collecting pieces for the hotel, along with her impeccable taste and furnishings. Siobhan's culinary skills were what would make the hotel a success. The hotel opened in January 2003, and Siobhan's barbecues quickly became a highlight of guest stays and were popular among the locals. Siobhan and Brian would regularly travel back and forth between Majorca and Ireland. However, during the holiday season, which spanned from March to December, Brian would travel back to Ireland more frequently. This meant that Siobhan was left in charge of running the business in Majorca while also raising their son, Daniel. Later, people who knew Siobhan would say that towards the end, they could see that she was not happy and was exhausted from doing everything. They felt there was an atmosphere of tension when Brian was around. However, because Jovan's family was so large, Siobhan would frequently receive visits from one or a few of them, and she was very glad to see them. These visits seemed to lift her spirits and put a pep in her step. Siobhan was very independent, but she also greatly valued the closeness of her family. A few years into owning the property in Spain, Brian and Siobhan decided to build a new house beside their property in Dublin, hoping to sell the original house and move into the new house or rent out either of the properties. Siobhan came home to Dublin for the break. In February 2006, she consulted a lawyer about legally separating and what she had to do. The solicitor advised her to keep a diary of the goings-on between herself and Brian. She enrolled their son Daniel in a local school and was going to approach Brian about her and their son moving into the new house that was being built next door. While Siobhan loved what she had built out there, she was very much on her own, overworked, and trying to raise their son with no family around her for support. On the morning of Tuesday, February 2006, it was Brian's birthday. Siobhan's sister Niamh arrived at Siobhan's house as usual. While she normally arrived at 9 a.m. to leave her car in the driveway and catch the bus into the city, this morning, She did not arrive until 9:30 a.m. As she had her own key, she let herself into the house and found 3-year-old Daniel wandering around on his own downstairs. Niamh then went upstairs to Siobhan's bedroom door and found it was locked. There was no reply when she called her name. Niamh then called her father and mother and informed them of the situation. When the father arrived, he broke down the door and found Siobhan lying in the bedroom near the ensuite door. Owen reached down and touched Siobhan on the head, and then the leg, and found she was cold. He knew then that his beloved daughter was dead. She was only 38 years old. The key to the bedroom was found on the floor, just inches away from the main bedroom door, and it appeared to have been pushed under. Owen immediately contacted the Garda, Irish police. When they arrived and examined the scene, they felt it was staged. Photos had been placed around Siobhan, almost like a shrine. A cord was partially wrapped around Siobhan, and the cord had been broken. When the forensic team arrived and examined the scene, they found indentations at the top of the unsweetened door, and the other part of the vacuum cord was wrapped around the door handle on the inside of the door, making it look like she had tried to hang herself. It later emerged in court that the cord would have snapped within 5 seconds due to Siobhan's weight, and she would have had to have been at least 6 inches off the ground. These two factors, combined with other evidence, indicated that it was impossible for Siobhan to have taken her own life. It was also determined that Siobhan had been dead for a few hours, as rigor mortis had already set in. The Gator imposed a 2-day media blackout on the case and advised the family not to speak to the press. After Siobhan's killing, it was said that the Gator took this step to try and avoid publicity of the case and to prevent a repeat of what had happened in the Rachel O'Reilly case 18 months earlier, where no charges had yet been brought. The blackout was lifted when Brian's mother-in-law informed him of Siobhan's passing. The McLaughlin family gathered, united in grief, while Brian received little sympathy, his sister offering consolation. The family referred to Siobhan by her maiden name, evidently privy to information unknown to others. Brian was extensively questioned. Could he leave? Only to be told he had to speak to the detectives first. He also questioned whether they would want the clothes he was wearing, which was strange. Brian was eventually allowed to leave after speaking with the detectives, and he did not hand over the clothes for testing, as he had asked for a specific item of clothing from the back bedroom to change into. The police officers did not want to give him these clothes, so they let him leave with the clothes he was wearing. He went to stay with his parents along with Daniel. Later that evening, Gwadi went to the house to retrieve the clothes he was wearing, and it was discovered that his mother had washed the clothes. Very convenient. On Thursday, March 2nd, 49-year-old Brown was brought in for questioning and detained for 12 hours. Reports indicate he was picked up from his parents' home. After initially agreeing to cooperate with the investigation, he refused to answer any of the questions asked. He was released that evening. Gwadi told the press that they were conducting further inquiries, and a file would be prepared for the Director of Public Prosecutions. The Gwadi interviewed Siobhan's friends and family, and they discovered that Siobhan was unhappy in her marriage and had visited a solicitor weeks before she died. She had also contacted the Citizens Advice Bureau for advice on separation and dividing assets. The family also revealed that they were suspicious of Brian and that he was a controlling individual. They provided an example of Siobhan being made to take out the dishes from the dishwasher and being required to wash them by hand because it was too expensive to run the dishwasher. He controlled the money, and she had to get his approval for everything. Siobhan sold her apartment, and Brian moved them to Spain. One of the sisters would say it was his dream to move to Spain, not Siobhan's. Siobhan's life was in Ireland, and she had no one in Spain. It was his way of isolating her from her friends and family. There was also a growing rift between Brian and the McLaughlin family. Brian delayed the funeral by 10 days after asking for a second autopsy. When a death notice was published in the newspaper, the McLaughlin family referred to Siobhan as McLaughlin and not Carney, and never mentioned Brian. Meanwhile, they published a separate notice in a different newspaper. At the funeral on the March 11th, a picture was placed beside the coffin of Siobhan and her son, but Brian was left out. Additionally, at the funeral, the Kearney and McLaughlin families sat separately in the church. They did not look at each other or interact on the day. This is characteristic of Irish people. We do not hesitate to express our genuine feelings about someone. The week after the funeral, the Garter traveled to Spain and conducted a search of the hotel that Siobhan and Brian owned. Furthermore, Brian's mobile data was recovered, and it placed him at the scene of the crime at the time they believed Siobhan died. Witnesses reported seeing Brian in the driveway at the time he claimed to be at his brother's on the morning of the murder. Brian's DNA was also found on a part of the vacuum cord. On June 22, 2006, Brian was arrested again and questioned at Dundrum Garda Station. He was questioned for 8 hours before being released without charge. The guard felt they had enough evidence at this stage and sent a complete file with all the new evidence gathered over the months to the Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP. It was now a waiting game. Meanwhile, Brian went to Spain to oversee all the preparations for the hotel's new season opening. However, once word spread about the murder, cancellations started coming in, and staff also quit, considering it too difficult to work without Siobhan, who was the backbone of the business's success. The staff's loyalty was to Siobhan, not Brian, which reflects the kind of person Siobhan was. The Guardia again returned to the hotel in Spain, and under oath in front of a Spanish judge, the staff gave evidence about Siobhan's demeanor in the weeks before her death. On December 10, 2006, Siobhan's family held a vigil outside her house where she was killed. Her sister said, "We are utterly distraught without Siobhan, but we are equally determined and will not rest until her killer is brought to justice." Siobhan was the embodiment of fun, life, joy, a terrific mother, and an adorable and hilarious sister and daughter, a true friend, and she will never be forgotten. 200 people turned up at the vigil. They held hands, sang hymns, and held up pictures of Siobhan. In January 2007, the newspapers once again spoke to Gotti's sources, and they said they were confident that an arrest would be made soon. However, the amount of evidence was substantial, and it would take time to go through it. On Tuesday, January 2007, the inquest into Siobhan's death was postponed. The McLaughlin family appealed to the public for fresh information to convict the main suspect, Brian, as the Director of Public Prosecutions announced they needed even more evidence to go for a conviction of murder against Brian. Brian did not attend the short hearing. On May 30, 2007, Kearney was arrested at his home next to his original home with his kids. He was charged with Siobhan's murder, brought to court, and remanded to prison. His response was not guilty, and no bail request was made. The McLaughlin family attended the hearing, but Kearney avoided eye contact and chewed gum disrespectfully. Kearney was freed on bail on June 6, 2007 after appealing to the High Court at Clover Hill Prison the previous day. His release came with conditions. He had to surrender his passport, pay €100, and provide a €55,000 bond from an independent juror, which his brother Patrick supplied. He also had to sign in weekly at Dundrum Garda Station. In July, a date was set for the trial to begin 6 months later, with a 4-week time frame to hear all evidence and reach a verdict. So the trial was to start in early 2008. On February 11th, Kearney appeared for trial before Justice Barry White and a jury of 12. He pleaded not guilty. However, one juror worked for a home security company that had installed and serviced the Kearney residence system. While the defense was willing to continue with 11 jurors, the prosecution objected, and the judge agreed. The jury was dismissed, and a new one sworn in a week later. It was the prosecution's case that Kearney had murdered Siobhan, tried to stage it as a suicide, and left his son alone before going to work. The McLaughlin family testified about the events, and Siobhan's father found her dead. Her mother also recounted the morning's happenings, including Neve's wrong actions towards the authorities and Kearney. She said when Kearney arrived home, she broke the news to him that Siobhan was dead upstairs. When she had been on the phone with him, she had not told him what was wrong, and Kearney never asked. Deja also confirmed that in 1999, Siobhan had signed herself into the St. John of God's psychiatric unit after suffering from stress at work and what was described as a little breakdown. But after 5 days, she returned to work. Bridget, Siobhan's sister, stated that in February 2005, Kearney phoned her to say that Siobhan was suffering from her nerves again. But when Bridget phoned Siobhan, she was perfectly fine. Ward, who worked for Colors Electrical with Kearney, said Kearney was in the habit of arriving to work between 8:30 a.m. and 9 a.m. But on the morning of Siobhan's murder, he arrived extra early between 7:50 a.m. and 8 a.m. A solicitor confirmed that multiple letters regarding the separation had been sent to Kearney, but he never responded to any of the correspondence. Kearney's statement to the guards was then read aloud. Kearney told the securities guards that on the morning of Siobhan's death, he had noticed her door was locked. The previous night, Siobhan and Daniel had returned home from a visit to her friend's house around 8:30 p.m., and Kearney had put Daniel to bed and slept in the same room, while Siobhan slept in the master bedroom. Kearney had said they woke up at 7 a.m. the next morning, had breakfast, and Kearney put on a DVD for Daniel, went upstairs to brush his teeth, and then attempted to enter Siobhan's room, but it was locked. He called out that he was leaving, went downstairs, kissed Daniel goodbye, and left for work. The court adjourned when a juror fell ill, but returned the next day. Evidence showed Siobhan couldn't have hanged herself. The pathologist found marks on her neck and chin, 3 larynx fractures, blood, and chin abrasions. She said the neck marks didn't come from hanging, significant force was applied, and Siobhan was assaulted in bed, gripped by the neck, and a ligature used to hasten her death. The security guards reported no signs of forced entry as the house's windows and doors were in good working condition. The alarm company confirmed that the system was activated at 10:50 p.m. the previous night and then immediately deactivated, and it was reactivated at 7:37 a.m. the next morning before being turned off again. A thorough search of the Kearney residence uncovered a diary in the airing cupboard, and the writing inside was confirmed to be Saban's by her sister. Saban's solicitor had advised her to maintain a diary documenting the events of her marriage to Kearney. Additionally, Saban's passport was found wrapped in sheets and clothing in another area, and a €500 note was discovered in a drawer among wrapping paper. A financial forensic agent was next to take the stand. Kearney did own properties in Ireland and had a stake in the electrical business plus the hotel. But while he was asset-rich, he was cash-poor. On Monday, March, closing arguments began. The defense were first, and they said the prospect of splitting with Siobhan did not suit Kearney financially. He wanted to sell one of the houses at Knocknashie, but if Siobhan wanted to move into one of them, this would not be an option, and Kearney would have to work out his debt. In some other way, the fact that Siobhan had started to squirrel away money, hide her passport, keep a diary of her relationship with Kearney, and send solicitor letters showed her seriousness about leaving him. Siobhan was looking forward to her future and making plans, which showed that she was not suicidal. The evidence shown by forensics also showed that it was next to impossible that she had taken her own life. Kearney even admitted that he, Siobhan, and their son had been the only ones present that night. The defense recommended caution as the prosecution had shown no hard evidence, and it was all circumstantial evidence. They said the jury needed to pay attention to what was missing in the case. There was no history of violence, no custody dispute, no alcohol abuse or jealousy. The jury was asked to ignore the emotions of the McLaughlin family when they were giving evidence. It is known that there doesn't have to be outward signs of abuse, as it's the rabbit hole of a course of control, which the family would say there was plenty of. Seaborn was strangled, and she had known Kearney since a very young age. There were no visible signs of physical violence, but there were extreme levels of control, like Kearney telling her to take the dirty dishes out of the dishwasher and hand wash them because it would cost too much money. When Siobhan finally said she was going to a solicitor, that's when Kearney couldn't cope, and he took her life. Coercive control is considered a form of domestic abuse even if there is no physical violence. This is a growing issue that we are only now starting to address in the 2020s. On the March 4th, Justice Barry White charged the jury and referred to the victim as Rachel rather than Seaborn in his summing up, which was a terrible mistake. It so happened that, at the same time, he was overseeing the case of Rachel O'Reilly, and he apologized. It wasn't the first or the last time that both women would be mentioned in each other's trial, as they both had died within 18 months of each other under similar circumstances. The jury was discharged that evening, and the following evening, they came back with the verdict of guilty of murder by a majority verdict of 11-1. The McLaughlins wept and hugged each other as the verdict sunk in. Kearney made no reaction, but his daughter who sat next to him wept. And Kearney took his wedding ring off and took his wallet out and handed them to her. Kearney was sentenced to life there and then, and the McLaughlins asked to give a victim impact statement. But this was denied, which I don't understand why. Kearney was escorted to a van and brought to Whitfield Prison to start his sentence. Kearney lodged an appeal straight away, and it was heard in February 2009, and the three-judge panel dismissed the appeal. In 2012, Kearney was refused permission to bring his appeal to the Supreme Court. 7 years later, in 2019, Kearney's applications for parole were refused on 2 occasions. Kearney's sister told her local radio news network that the parole board had recommended Kearney for 2 outside prison visits with his family, suggesting they were preparing him for release. However, the parole board will only recommend his release if he admits his guilt, which he has never done. As of 2022, although the Minister for Justice has the final say on any release, Kearney remains incarcerated. In prison, Kearney is a trained counselor to help other inmates with their mental health and works for the organization The Samaritans. He is also trained in first aid. While in prison, he decided to sell the hotel in Spain, but then took it off the market in 2010. The hotel was then run by his brother Patrick and his wife, and it is still open, although it may be under new ownership since then. Kearney said he wanted to keep the hotel in order to facilitate his son's education. The McLaughlin family sought to adopt Daniel, but it's unclear whether they did or how he is doing, which is good, as he deserves some peace, as does his half-sister Aisling. A family with 3 children lived in the house where Siobhan was murdered, but it was up for sale for €1,400,000 back in February 2008. It's presumed that it has been sold since then. Kearney's daughter did live in the new house while he was still a free man, but there have been no updates on her either. If Kearney decided to sell off all his assets and pay off his debts, he will have a significant amount of money when he gets out, and he may even become a millionaire. The family were considering suing him for Saubin's share at least, if not all, but there are no public details on this. Saubin's sister released a statement after Kearney's conviction, saying that while their lives were utterly destroyed by Saubin's death, Siobhan had now got justice. They are grateful to have known and had someone as special as Shani in their lives, which was their nickname for her. However, they miss her every hour of every day, and the unbearable longing to see her and protect her never leaves them, even though they know it's too late. 7-year-old Alexis Patterson was a first-grade student at the Highmount Boulevard Community School in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in February. While she lived less than a block away from her school, her stepfather, Laurent Bourgeois, would still walk her there in the mornings. On the morning of May 3rd, he walked her to the school and watched her walk into the playground with her pink Barbie backpack. Alexis would not return home from school. Alexis was absent from class that day. However, students reported seeing her on the playground and some claimed that she was crying. While the school was the last place Alexis was seen, that does not necessarily mean that was the location she went missing from. Alexis was a well-behaved child with no history of trying to run away. However, the night before she went missing, Alexis got into an argument with her mother, Ivon Patterson. Ivon did not think that Alexis finished her homework properly, and as a punishment Alexis was not allowed to bring cupcakes to school for her classmates as planned. Angry at her mother, Alexis could have wandered off after refusing to go into class and been abducted off of school grounds. However, this theory is challenged by some students who say they saw Alexis on the school playground after school. Perhaps Alexis acted out and did not go into school, but did not want her mother to find out, so she remained at the school playground for the entire time she was supposed to be in class. Given the short distance between her home and the school, if Alexis were abducted in the afternoon, it could not have been very far from the schoolyard. Supporting the idea that Alexis was abducted from the High Mound School were reports of a mysterious red truck. Students reported seeing a red truck parked near the school in the days leading up to Alexis going missing. The truck did not drop off or pick up any children. Sightings of the vehicle ceased after Alexis went missing. A solid link between the truck and Alexis's disappearance has never been made. The search for Alexis was one of the largest in Milwaukee's history. Officers and volunteers performed land and water searches, and helicopters were used to search larger areas. However, the investigation was not without controversy. Authorities are criticized for focusing on the criminal backgrounds of some of Alexis's family members. Alexis's father, Kenya Campbell, was in the process of being released from prison and multiple driving without a license charges when Alexis went missing. While he could not have been directly involved with his daughter's disappearance, he agreed to meet with authorities and cooperate with the investigation. Laurent Bourgeois, Alexis's stepfather and the last known adult to see her, had a far more troubling criminal past. He had served 2 years in prison for drug charges and had received immunity in return for his testimony about his role as a getaway car driver in a 1994 bank robbery that resulted in the death of a police officer. There are also unconfirmed reports that he failed a polygraph about Alexis's disappearance. However, there has never been any evidence linking anyone in Alexis's life to her disappearance. In 2016, hopes were high that Alexis was alive and well. A man from Ohio called authorities claiming to know a woman who could be Alexis. This woman supposedly had no memory of her life prior to the age of 10 and bore a strong resemblance to an age-progressed image of Alexis released in 2012. The woman in Ohio did not believe she was Alexis. She provided police with documents that verified her true identity. Police in Bryan, Ohio still obtained a voluntary DNA sample from the woman and sent it to Wisconsin. Tests showed that the woman was not Alexis, but these findings are controversial to many close to the case. Following the announcement that the DNA samples did not match, the man who originally alerted the authorities to the woman in Ohio came forward to speak to the media. The man who has only ever been publicly identified by his first name Joshua, so as to prevent the public from being able to infer the woman's identity, was the ex-husband of the woman whose DNA was tested. Joshua alleges that the original test used a sample from a toothbrush collected in February 2002 that did not conclusively belong to Alexis. The police have never confirmed where they obtained their sample from. Both Joshua and Alexis's mother Ayanna believe that Joshua's ex-wife is Alexis. They have been petitioning authorities to perform a new DNA test using a sample from Ayanna to test against the DNA from the woman that they believe to be Alexis. Police have never performed such a test as they believe the woman to have been conclusively ruled out as Alexis. A wreath is laid out at the High Mound School every year as part of a ceremony to commemorate Alexis on the anniversary of her disappearance. Alexis's mother, who divorced Alexis's stepfather shortly after Alexis went missing, faithfully attends despite how emotionally taxing it is for her, while she believes her daughter is the Ohio woman ruled out by police. Patterson still struggles to not bring her child at home. Bianca LeBron was a confident and outgoing 5th grader at the Elias House School in Bridgeport, Connecticut. The 10-year-old loved to shop, and her favorite color was purple. She lived with her mother, Carmelita Torres, and her stepfather, Angelo Garcia. While they were no longer together, Carmelita and Wilberto LeBron, Bianca's father, maintained a good relationship as they raised their daughter. On the morning of November 7, 2001, Bianca ate breakfast as her mother got ready to leave for work. Bianca and 4 of her cousins walked the 2 blocks from her home together as they did every day. Their custom was to also walk home from school together, but Bianca would not be with them to walk home that afternoon. At 4:30 p.m., Carmelita became concerned because Bianca had not returned home. This was not immediately alarming, however. Bianca had lots of relatives who lived within walking distance of her home, and she loved to spend time with her many friends. This would not have been the first time she had failed to call home to report whose house she was visiting after school. She had once even spent the night with a friend without telling her mother, not understanding the panic that it would cause her. However, when 8:30 rolled around with no sign of Bianca, her mother began searching for her. Having no luck finding Bianca with her family or friends, Carmelita called the police at 10:30 p.m. The Elias House School was obviously an important site in this case. Police went to the school in the morning to interview school staff and Bianca's classmates. Bianca had made it to school that morning and had been waiting in line to enter the building with her teacher and other students in her class. She told some of her friends that her uncle would be taking her shopping that day. As Bianca loved to shop, this did not seem strange. Just before she entered the building, Bianca told her teacher that she was going to speak with her uncle. The teacher did not stop her. Students at the school reported seeing Bianca get into a dilapidated two-tone brown van with a Hispanic male driver in his early 20s. The man did not try to obscure his face from the crowd of students, and Bianca seemed to be going willingly. So her friends assumed that the man was Bianca's uncle, picking her up for her shopping trip. There was just one problem. Bianca did not have an uncle. Based on interviews with the students in the schoolyard that day, police were able to develop a sketch of the man believed to have abducted Bianca. In February, police announced that they were trying to locate a 20-year-old man named Jason Gonzalez, whose actual name will be discovered to be Jason Lara. Police did not name Jason as a suspect, rather as an acquaintance of Bianca's. However, Jason resembled the composite image of the man Bianca left school with, and he had a friend who owned a van similar to the one the man had been driving. He had a criminal record that began before Bianca went missing and extended well after. He had also left Bridgeport less than a month after Bianca disappeared. Jason knew Bianca because his mother was dating Bianca's great-uncle. While it is known that the two knew each other, the full extent of their interactions has been highly debated. In the wake of Bianca's disappearance, reports range from Bianca having a simple girl heard crush on him to allegations that witnesses had seen the man kissing the little girl. Jason and his family have always maintained that he was never inappropriate with Bianca and that he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Jason eventually met with police, but they alleged that he was not very cooperative. While Jason appears to be a solid suspect on paper, no actual evidence connects him to Bianca's abduction, and he has an alibi for the time it occurred. Despite Bianca's family doing everything from appearing on television shows, consulting psychics, and giving interviews to local newspapers, few leads have surfaced in the case over the years. In February 2009, police dug up large sections of Bridgeport's Seaside Park after receiving a tip that Bianca had been buried there. Nothing was recovered. While Melita Torres has never wavered in her belief that her daughter is still alive and will one day be found, she had Bianca declared legally dead so as to file a wrongful death suit against the Elias House School. In the immediate aftermath of Bianca's disappearance, the Elias House School suspended Bianca's teacher without pay and updated their security and attendance policies. However, this did not undo the negligence shown when Bianca was allowed to leave school property with a man whose identity was not verified. Carmelita was ultimately awarded $750,000. The Elias House School has since been shut down. As a result of Bianca's disappearance, the once civil relationship between her parents has turned sour. They only communicate through their attorneys. Carmelita Torres eventually moved out of the home she shared with Bianca after more than a decade of waiting there for her daughter to come home. Bianca's father Gilberto moved to Florida, where he walked his 3 other children way up to the door of their schools every day for fear that one of them might meet the same fate as her sister. As of 2018, if she is still alive, Bianca will be 27 years old. Cary Sayegh was a student at the Albert Einstein Hebrew Day School in Las Vegas, Nevada. On October 25, 1978, the 6-year-old was enjoying the playground at lunchtime. Unlike his classmates, Cary would never make it back to class. Students reported an unfamiliar Rolls-Royce on the school grounds around the time Cary vanished. According to a 12-year-old student at the school, Cary had been forced into the car by one of the 4 men who were riding in it. Approximately 3 hours after Cary had last been seen, a neighbor of the Sayegh, who was in their home to help Cary's distraught parents, answered their phone. It was a ransom call. The caller demanded that Cary's parents prepare $500,000 to be exchanged for their son. He stated that he would call back on that Friday, the 27th, with further instructions on how to pay the money and get Cary back. October 27th came and went without any further communication from the kidnappers. While $500,000 is not an insignificant amount of money, Cary's father was in a position where he could have procured it. Sol Sayegh had started a carpet business upon immigrating to the United States, and by 1978 the business was very successful. Early on in the investigation, there were concerns that Sol may have been the reason for the kidnapping or less flattering reasons. At the time of the abduction, Sol Sayegh was under indictment for a conspiracy to bribe a gaming commission official. His trial had to be postponed because Cary went missing, and the charges were ultimately dropped on compassionate grounds. The theory that the bribery charge led to Cary's abduction lost support quickly because an alternative theory gained traction even quicker. Police quickly focused in on a former employee of Sowell's, habitual criminal Gerald Burgess. Several students claimed to have seen Burgess at Cary's school around the time he went missing. Burgess was known to the students because he would occasionally work as a handyman at the school. Burgess, who was dating one of the secretaries of the school, claims he was only there to drop off lunch for his girlfriend's son. The neighbor who answered the ransom call also immediately identified the voice they heard as Gerald. Suspicions against Gerald increased when he led police to one of Cary's shoes out in the Nevada desert. Burgess claimed that he knew where the shoe would be because he had been contacted by the kidnappers and was acting as a go-between between them and the Sayegh family. He was not able to substantiate this claim. While most of the evidence against Burgess was circumstantial, in 1981 a grand jury indicted him on charges of kidnapping and attempting to obtain money under false pretenses in relation to Cary's case. And in 1982 he went to trial. Burgess alleged that Cary was alive and living in Israel, but again, he could not substantiate these claims. Convicting Burgess was going to be a challenge from the onset of the trial, but it grew more and more difficult as it progressed. While several students claimed to have seen Burgess at the school, only the one student claimed to have seen Cary being forced into the car. This student testified at the trial that Burgess was not the man he had seen force Cary into the car. Burgess was acquitted due to lack of evidence. While Burgess never served time in relation to Cary's case, he was not a free man for quite a long time after Cary went missing. Burgess was convicted for a sexual assault he committed against a woman at the Albert Einstein Hebrew Day School just a week prior to Cary going missing from there. He was also sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for swindling a couple from Texas out of $200,000. Burgess's legal trouble continued later in his life and renewed suspicions about him in relation to Cary's abduction. In February, Burgess was arrested by the FBI following an 18-month investigation. Burgess, who as a convicted felon was prohibited from so much as possessing a firearm or ammunition, sold weapons to an undercover FBI agent and a confidential witness. During one of these transactions, he also threatened the life of the mayor of Las Vegas and a former federal judge. In the other, he made arrangements to dispose of a body for the confidential witness. Burgess told the FBI's witness that he would get rid of the body by sealing it in a steel drum and burying it in the desert. He also claimed that this was the method he used to dispose of Cary's body in 1978. Burgess had rented welding equipment just days before Cary went missing. Burgess cannot be tried for kidnapping due to double jeopardy. He has never faced any additional charges in the case. Saul say his life faced numerous more problems following the disappearance of his son. He sold his business in 1996, and in 1997, he and Cary's mother Marilyn divorced. That same year, he wrote a number of bad checks and casinos and went into over $7 million in debt to them. He fled to Israel to avoid felony charges in relation to these bad checks, but returned to Las Vegas after negotiating a settlement with the casinos. His federal charges were dismissed once he upheld the conditions of the settlement. While circumstances seem to indicate that Cary was killed by Gerald Burgess shortly after he went missing, his body has never been found and doubts about his fate remain. In the late 1990s, there were whispers that Cary was alive and living in Boston, but nothing ever became of them. Cary's fate remains unknown. The case of Alicia Ross. A young Canadian woman named Alicia Ross vanished without a trace from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. The police were unable to find either a body or any significant evidence, and as a result, the investigation merely stagnated. The case might have remained unsolved had the criminal not turned himself in to the police. Alicia Ross was born on February 8, 1980 in the Canadian city of Markham in the province of Ontario. There is no information about her biological parents, but it is known that they gave up their rights to the child, and she was adopted at a few months old by a couple named Marvin and Sharon Ross. Her adoptive parents provided her with love and care, and they did everything to ensure that their daughter had everything she needed and could fully develop her talents. When Alicia started school, her adoptive parents decided to divorce, but they maintained a friendly relationship and continued to participate together in their daughter's life. Soon, Sharon remarried, and her new husband, named Julius Forrest, treated the child as if she were his own daughter. The girl performed well in school, demonstrated exceptional skills in drawing, and also developed a passion for photography and a love for discovering new cities and countries. After finishing school, she spent a year in Australia, where she traveled and enjoyed life before returning home and enrolling in university in February. The 25-year-old Alicia went on a hiking trip in the mountains with her friends, where she met a young man named Sean, with whom she began a romantic relationship in early July. He was 4 years older than her, but the small age difference did not bother the couple. On August 16th, the young woman, along with her adoptive mother and their dogs, went for a stroll in the park. Alicia appeared cheerful and shared that she was expecting a promotion at work to the position of senior sales manager in the coming days. She was very proud, as she had been working hard for a long time, and her efforts were about to be rewarded. Additionally, the young woman discussed her boyfriend, Sean, whom she had been dating for just over a month, but seemed deeply in love with. Alicia hoped that this romance could grow into something more meaningful in the future, and expressed a desire to introduce her new boyfriend to her adoptive parents by arranging a family dinner. After her walk in the park, the mother returned home, and her daughter went on a date with her sweetheart. She promised not to be gone long, as she had to get up early for work the next day, where her promotion was to be decided. The women said their goodbyes and went their separate ways. Sharon never saw her daughter alive again. The mysterious disappearance of her own house that night, after meeting with Sean, is what led to the unsolved case. Alicia invited him to her house, and they had a great time together. Around midnight, the young man went home, and Alicia accompanied him to the door, which served as a second exit from the backyard. They said goodbye with a kiss, and he left, promising to call her as soon as he got home. Around midnight, as promised, Sean called his girlfriend, but she didn't answer the phone. He wasn't overly concerned, thinking Alicia had simply fallen asleep since she had to get up early for work. However, the next morning, when he tried to call her again and she still didn't pick up, he became genuinely worried and contacted a mutual acquaintance who worked in the same office as Alicia. From her, he learned that Alicia hadn't come to work, and he immediately rushed to her house. On August 17th in the morning, Sharon and Julius planned to play golf with friends and left the house at 10. They saw their daughter's car in the driveway, but assumed someone had taken her, so they went about their day. A while later, Sean went to Alicia's house, but couldn't find her, so he called the police to report her missing. He then called Sharon to inform her. The couple rushed home, where the police were already there. Sean was the first to notice Alicia was missing and inform the police. He was also the last to see her, the night before she disappeared, saying they had parted ways at the gate around midnight and hadn't heard from her since. When Sharon and Julius approached the house, law enforcement was already there, inspecting the area and speaking with Sean, who had called them. The young man appeared visibly nervous and distraught. When the mother looked into Alicia's room, she immediately noticed that all her daughter's personal belongings, which she never left the house without, were in their places. Her purse, passport, driver's license, keys, cell phone, as well as her bank cards and cash were all left in the room, suggesting she wouldn't have gone anywhere, let alone left without them. The gate was open but not forced, implying that the missing person either let her abduct her in or willingly left with someone from the yard. In the backyard, the police found some disturbance. The lawn and flowers in one area were trampled as if someone had fallen there. Also, a pair of cigarettes and the right sandal of the girl, the one she had been wearing the evening before, were found on the ground, laid out in a straight line. Neither Alicia nor her parents smoked, so the cigarettes did not belong to them. And Sean claimed he never smoked that particular brand, leaving the ownership and arrangement of the cigarettes unclear. Sean was almost immediately considered the prime suspect. Firstly, he was noticeably nervous, and his account seemed somewhat confused and disjointed. Secondly, he was the first to report his girlfriend's disappearance to the police, even before speaking with her parents and confirming that they too had not seen her. Thus, he definitely knew she was missing. Additionally, law enforcement found biological traces on the girl's bed belonging both to her and Sean. Based on this, The investigation speculated that Alicia might have denied Sean intimacy, and he decided to force her, then trying to cover his tracks, staged her disappearance, which he likely caused by ending her life. When Sean was brought to the police station, questioned, and the investigator's theory presented to him, the young man was shocked. He was distressed to be considered the primary suspect and swore he would never harm his girlfriend as he loved her. He also acknowledged that they did indeed have intimate moments that evening, but insisted it was consensual. The missing girl's parents also had nothing negative to say about Sean. He had not argued with their daughter, had not mistreated her, and she spoke only positively of him. Their relationship was developing quickly and quite happily, to the extent that Alicia even hoped to have a future with him. Moreover, the parents noted that their daughter had no plans or reasons to leave. She was eagerly awaiting a promotion at her beloved job, and being a responsible person, she would never just leave everything behind. But even if some unforeseen circumstances had arisen, she would certainly have informed her parents and definitely would not have left without her documents, money, and phone. The police lacked sufficient evidence or grounds to detain Sean, and so, after questioning him at the station, they released him. Nevertheless, law enforcement did not rule him out as a suspect and continued to monitor the young man. Sean himself appeared dejected and highly distressed. The extensive search effort for the missing woman began the day after her disappearance. Initially, a thorough inspection of the home and yard was conducted, and investigators closely examined the surrounding area and interviewed neighbors. However, no one reported hearing or seeing anything suspicious that night. Law enforcement theorized that the woman disappeared sometime between midnight when she said goodbye to Sean and sunrise, a time when the streets are usually quiet and deserted, making it challenging to find witnesses. Alicia's photos were distributed as flyers throughout the city, providing phone numbers for people to report any information about her whereabouts. The story of the missing woman was widely covered in the news and featured in popular publications, sparking significant public interest and prompting hundreds of volunteers and concerned citizens to join the search. The police received numerous daily calls related to the case, although most of the information turned out to be false or mistaken. Nevertheless, each tip and theory was investigated in the hope of finding any leads. The search area was continuously expanded, involving more people. Thorough checks were conducted in abandoned buildings, wooded areas, and wastelands. Sean also actively participated in the search efforts, despite still being the prime suspect. Feeling wronged, the young man turned to the media and gave a significant interview where he expressed his deep love for Alicia and showed photos of them looking very happy together. He tearfully pleaded for help in the search, appearing utterly devastated by the situation. The search for Alicia became one of the most extensive operations in Ontario's history. Every difficult-to-reach ravine and marshy area was scoured, but no clues, leads, or even hints about the missing woman's location were found. Her parents also appealed to the public through the media, expressing their belief that their daughter was alive, but being held against her will somewhere. They implored whoever had their daughter to let her return home unharmed and not to harm her in any way. Sean's unexpected arrest led the police to lean towards the theory that someone Alicia knew personally had abducted and possibly ended her life. This hypothesis was supported by the lack of signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, and the gate being left open, but no concrete leads were found. The cigarettes found on the ground bore only a heavily smeared fingerprint, which couldn't be identified. Investigators thoroughly checked Alicia's contacts and reviewed all calls and messages on her phone and email, yet nothing suspicious was uncovered. On the 6th day of the search, the case was officially reclassified as a criminal act, despite the lack of evidence. Sean remained the prime suspect. Sean lived alone in his own house, located about 10 miles from Alicia's home. After realizing that public suspicion had intensified following his media appearance, he stopped participating in the search and refused to speak with the press. Investigators interviewed Sean 3 more times, but his story remained consistent. He was then offered a lie detector test, which he refused, convincing the police even more firmly that he was involved in the crime. 2 weeks after the disappearance, Sean was arrested on an unrelated charge. He was taken into custody late at night for driving under the influence and resisting arrest. Speculations arose that he was attempting to drown his guilt in alcohol. Following Sean's arrest, Alicia's parents gave another interview, sharing that they had not personally known the young man and only knew about him through their daughter's accounts. They believed she was happy, but now they considered the possibility that their daughter might have withheld certain details to avoid upsetting them, though she had planned to introduce her boyfriend to her family soon. Police interviewed Sean's neighbors to determine if they had noticed anything unusual recently, such as him disposing of large trash bags, behaving suspiciously, leaving unexpectedly, or cleaning his car. However, no significant information emerged from these inquiries. Detectives were left hoping that Sean might eventually confess to everything. About a month after Alicia's disappearance, the media attention surrounding her case began to fade. The search continued, but it was no longer prominently featured in newspapers or news broadcasts, and the investigation seemed to have reached a dead end. The only option left for law enforcement was to keep pressuring Sean, hoping he would eventually confess to the crime. Then a completely unexpected development occurred in the case on September 20th, 2005, more than a month after Alicia's disappearance. 31-year-old Daniel Sylvester, a local resident, called the police and confessed to ending the girl's life, revealing where he had hidden her body. It's important to note that this man had not been under suspicion previously, and the police had not considered him at all during their initial investigation. At first, it appeared that the man merely sought fame and attention and had decided to take responsibility for the most notorious case in recent years. However, all doubts were dispelled when the police discovered the girl's body at the location he had specified. Daniel Sylvester was an unemployed recluse who lived in his mother's house, which was adjacent to the Ross family home. The two properties were separated by overgrown shrubs, creating a nearly impenetrable barrier. Despite living virtually side by side for their entire lives, Daniel and the victims had never interacted before. Alicia had seen Daniel on his property a few times and considered him mentally unwell due to his strange behavior. The police had not shown an interest in Daniel earlier, as he seemed to be a reclusive and isolated individual who had not drawn attention to himself. Daniel had significant social challenges from a young age. He struggled to make friends, was ridiculed at school, and every effort to form relationships ended in complete failure, leading him to develop a deep resentment towards women. As a child, girls would call him a loser and say they would never associate with someone like him. At age 8, Sylvester was diagnosed with a social behavioral disorder and had been under ongoing psychological treatment, but the therapy did not provide much improvement. In his teenage years, he confessed that he had fantasies of suddenly attacking and overpowering a girl, which excited him. However, specialists were confident that these fantasies would remain just that and not manifest into real actions. After finishing school, Daniel stopped attending therapy sessions, decided not to continue his education, and became a recluse. He lived in his mother's house, isolating himself from the outside world, spending his days sitting in his room, often on adult websites, and occasionally venturing out in the evenings to secretly watch his neighbors peeping into their windows. He particularly enjoyed watching when someone was engaged in sexual activity, as this spectacle excited him. Yet, Daniel remained a virgin well into his 30s, satisfying his desires through solitary activities. The neighbors hardly ever saw him and thus considered him a harmless guy. Initially, Sylvester claimed that the girl's death was accidental, and he hid the body to avoid punishment. According to him, when he realized the girl showed no signs of life, he placed her in the trunk of his mother's car and drove about 50 miles out of town, hiding the body in a bushy ravine by the side of a country road. 3 weeks later, fearing that the body would be discovered, he moved it in the middle of the night even further away to a deserted area. The body was found in the place Daniel indicated, thereby dispelling the last doubts about his guilt. However, the condition of the remains indicated that the girl had been dealt with extreme cruelty. The injuries were such that it looked as if she had been hit by a car. An autopsy showed that Alicia had nearly all her ribs broken, her neck and both arms, and also suffered extensive closed cranial trauma with internal bleeding. The exact cause of death could not be determined, but at least 3 injuries were incompatible with life. Forensic experts were shocked as they had never encountered anything like it before. It was necessary to clarify the circumstances and chronology of events on that fateful evening to determine how exactly the girl received her injuries. The convict initially claimed that he had an argument with his neighbor on a bush-covered path between their homes. During the verbal altercation, the neighbor called him a loser, which angered him, and he struck her on the head. When she fell, he kicked her several times in the chest. Realizing she was not breathing, he decided to hide the body and then moved it again when the search area expanded. However, there were missing details and specifics in his story that did not add up. It was unclear what Daniel was doing at his neighbor's house at night, why they began arguing, and what caused such a brutal beating. The evidence found at the scene was laid out in a straight line, making it challenging to reconstruct the full sequence of events. The investigation revealed that Sylvester had gone out to observe his neighbors. He noticed that Alicia's boyfriend had come over, and he approached their house closely as the couple was being intimate. He watched them from a window, then moved back to the bushes, but did not leave. As midnight approached, the lovers went outside and kissed by the gate, just a couple of feet away from the observing neighbor. When Sean left, the girl returned to the yard and noticed Daniel. She became very angry, realizing that he had been spying on her and her boyfriend all this time. She started yelling at him, calling him a pervert and demanding that he leave immediately. Finally, Alicia called him a loser, which acted as a trigger for Sylvester, as that was exactly what other girls had called him during his childhood. Filled with rage, Sylvester punched the girl forcefully on the head and knocked her to the ground. She tried to resist and grabbed her attacker's hair, but he began to choke her. When his grip loosened, Daniel quickly stood up and began kicking Alicia while she was lying down, primarily striking her chest, back, neck, and head. Forensic experts later counted 33 fractures on the victim's body and extensive internal bleeding. When the man realized his neighbor was dead, he moved her body to his garage, undressed her, and then masturbated to relieve the tension, according to his testimony. The examination confirmed that Sylvester did not violate the body. He then placed the corpse in the trunk of his mother's car and took it to a remote location outside the city. Upon returning home, the criminal took a shower, changed clothes, and behaved as if nothing had happened. His clothes, the victim's belongings, and the towels he used to clean the crime scene were packed in trash bags and disposed of. The trial and sentencing proceedings began only in April 2007, at which time new details were made public. The defendant confessed that he had ended his neighbor's life, but he and his lawyer insisted that it was unintentional. The defense demanded a psychiatric evaluation, arguing that Daniel was mentally ill and should not be held accountable for his actions, suggesting he be treated in a clinic instead of being incarcerated. However, the prosecution argued that despite his mental illness and anger management issues, Sylvester acted with full knowledge of the consequences of his actions. He kicked the girl mercilessly with all his might, knowing it would likely result in her death. Nevertheless, the court-ordered psychiatric evaluation confirmed that the defendant could indeed be considered fully responsible for his actions. Regarding the items found in the backyard, Daniel never admitted to having placed them there, arranged in a straight line. On May 7, 2007, the defendant was found guilty of a second-degree crime and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 16 years. A year later, Canadian singer-songwriter Kathleen Edwards wrote a song titled Alicia Ross, which portrayed the events from the young woman's perspective during the final moments of her life. The case of Ivon Baldelli, a hellish love story on a heavenly island. Sometimes the search for paradise on earth can lead one straight into a real-life hell from which escape is impossible. However, it's only fair to note that a significant factor in this journey is who accompanies you in search of this paradise. Choosing a companion should always be done with the utmost care and caution. Yet sometimes, even the person who seems closest and dearest can turn into a true, merciless monster. The tale of Ivon Baldelli and Brian Brimmager began like something out of a fairy tale. Ivon thought she had found true love for which she was ready to run to the ends of the earth. However, from the very beginning, her relationship raised concerns among Ivon's family who disapproved of her partner. Unfortunately, the family's worries were not unfounded. This complex case started in 2011 when a happy and in love Ivon left with her beloved for a tropical island. As it turned out, she was heading straight towards her own demise. Only several years later, disfigured fragments of her body were discovered in the swamp, bagged alongside the remains of her cherished pets. Ivon's family exerted considerable effort to achieve justice, efforts that cost another family member their life. Who was Ivon Baldelli? Ivon Olivia Baldelli, May Food, was born on June 30th, 1969 in a small town in the southern part of sunny California. She was the third and youngest child of Marjorie and James Food, growing up alongside her older brother Michael and sister Michelle, with whom she shared a particularly close bond from childhood. When Ivon was 13, her mother passed away after a long illness. A year later, her father remarried to Lillian Faust, and the grown children developed wonderful relationships with their stepmother, a kind and caring woman who loved her husband's children as her own. Ivon received a solid education and explored several career paths, but her main passion was always fashion design, and she dreamed of turning her hobby into a profitable business. However, luck never seemed to be on her side when it came to her personal life. She was married twice, but both marriages ended in separation. Additionally, a surgery she underwent in her youth, followed by complications, left Ivon unable to have children. After divorcing her second husband, Kevin Baldelli, in February 2007, Ivon lived alone in her small apartment with her beloved dog, whom she affectionately called her child. She remained in constant contact with her father and sister, calling them almost daily and making an effort to see her family at least once a month. Meeting Brian and the love triangle. In February 2009, as Ivon was preparing to celebrate her 40th birthday, she met a Marine named Brian Brimmager. At that time, he was legally married and raising a young son with his wife. Despite this, Brian was open to having an affair and shared with his mistress how unhappy he was in his marriage, claiming he hadn't filed for divorce solely because of his child, whom he didn't want to distress. Baldelli fell for this fit and handsome man at first sight and believed every word he said. Having experienced the pain of a loveless marriage herself and knowing how hard it can be to leave such a relationship, she didn't rush her partner, believing that the presence of a child was indeed the main obstacle. However, Brian wasn't as straightforward and sincere as he appeared. From a young age, his attractive looks had made him very popular with the opposite sex. He was accustomed to juggling multiple relationships simultaneously and expertly deceived the women who fell for him, promising each one marriage, a family, and eternal love. It soon came to light that the married Brimmager was not only seeing Ivon, but also had another mistress. This other woman was Christine Verhoeven, a stunning blonde with extensive connections. She was an analyst at the White House and had made a remarkable career during George W. Bush Jr.'s administration. When Ivon discovered the existence of another rival, she decided to confront the issue head-on and was ready to fight for the man she loved. Gathering her courage, she called her lover's wife to inform her that Brian was cheating on her with not just one, but two women. This revelation sparked a major scandal, forcing Brian to make a difficult choice. Eventually, he chose Ivon, though it's possible she pressured him into making this decision. A few months later, Brian officially divorced his wife and moved in with his new love interest. At that time, he was still serving in the Marines, but had been contemplating ending his military career for a while. The couple seemed genuinely happy, but Ivon's relatives remained wary of her new partner, doubting the sincerity of his feelings. Moving to a tropical paradise. In the summer of 2011, Brian began to talk about radically changing his life, leaving the service, moving away from the bustling city, and settling down on the tropical island. Ivon shared his sentiments, supported him in everything, and was ready to follow him wherever and whenever he decided. She believed she had met the most important man in her life and adored him. By September of the same year, the decision was final. The couple chose to move to Panama and settle on the small island of Caranero, a place that could truly be called a paradise. Ivon informed her family just before leaving, so they had no chance to persuade her to reconsider. Ivon sold her apartment, quit her job, and started packing for the journey. She took only a few bikinis, shorts, tank tops, and her sewing machine, hoping to fulfill her dream of opening a small boutique to create and sell custom outfits to tourists on the new island. In early September, Brian, Ivon, and her beloved little dog flew to Panama. They spent a couple of days in the country's capital before taking a ferry to Carnero Island, where they rented a house right on the oceanfront. The climate was hot and humid with little temperature variation, attracting a steady flow of tourists throughout the year, primarily diving and surfing enthusiasts. The island was just 1 square kilometer, so one could leisurely walk around it in about an hour. All the infrastructure was located along the coast, while the interior was dense jungle and swampy areas teeming with venomous snakes, spiders, and other wildlife, making it unsafe to venture into. Brian, who had been an excellent guitar player since his youth, brought his instrument with the intention of starting a musical career on the island, performing in entertainment venues. Within a week after moving, he had made connections with several local bar owners, and one of them happily offered him a job. He played in the evenings, entertaining the crowd, but his appreciative audience often bought him drinks as a compliment, leading him to drink heavily almost daily. Yvonne's business also developed very slowly with weak sales and virtually no profit. However, she didn't lose heart. She started working at one of the bars and even adopted a second dog she found on the island and decided to keep. She communicated with her sister, Michelle Valenzuela, almost daily, sharing everything. But her messages became increasingly shorter and more somber, which worried her family. The first few months on the island seemed like paradise to the couple. Yvonne hoped that Brian would propose, and they would have a romantic wedding ceremony on the ocean shore. The time passed. Brian didn't rush into marriage, and their relationship rapidly deteriorated. The mysterious disappearance. In early December, Michelle stopped receiving messages from Yvonne, which raised her concerns significantly. Then on December 14, 2011, Brian unexpectedly called Michelle, inquiring when he could stop by to pick up his SUV, which he had left in her garage before heading to Panama. This call and question caught Michelle off guard. It meant Brian had returned to the US and wanted to retrieve his vehicle. But where was Yvonne? Why hadn't she come back or even called? In response, Brian claimed he had explained everything in an email sent a few days earlier. He also mentioned that his now ex-girlfriend had supposedly sent her a message explaining the situation. Michelle checked her messages but found nothing, so she turned to her email. Indeed, there were 2 unread messages, one from her sister and one from her boyfriend. In his message, Brian stated that Yvonne had left him, running off with a new lover to Costa Rica. The other message, supposedly from Yvonne, claimed she had left Brian upon discovering his infidelity and learning that another woman had given birth to his child. It concluded with her saying she had met another man and gone to Costa Rica with him. The other woman turned out to be Brian's old friend, Christine Verhoeven, with whom he had been involved all along and who was pregnant with his child when he and Ivon flew to Panama. At first glance, everything seemed plausible and logical, especially since Ivon couldn't have children. The news that her partner had fathered a child with someone else could have been devastating for her. However, Ivon wasn't known for impulsive actions, and she would have certainly called her sister to discuss such significant changes in her life. Moreover, the tone of the supposed message from Yvonne was somewhat odd and unlike her previous communications, which raised further suspicions. When Michelle tried to determine her sister's current whereabouts, she couldn't get any concrete information. Calls went unanswered, and the messages that came through were brief and detached, saying things like, "I'm okay. I need some time. I'm not ready to talk about this." Michelle suggested that Brian should join her in filing a missing persons report. Brian appeared nervous, but insisted it wasn't necessary, claiming Yvonne was fine, capable of taking care of herself, and would decide when to come home on her own. Despite Brian's reluctance even to discuss the matter and his hasty departure after picking up his vehicle, a message from Yvonne's phone soon arrived stating she planned to return home in January for their father's birthday. This message provided Michelle with some relief, and she decided to wait a few more weeks, hoping Yvonne would return as indicated in the message. Search efforts and surprising discoveries. By mid-January, not only had Yvonne not returned home, but she also hadn't called even once during that time, and her messages had completely stopped. Moreover, Michelle was shocked to learn that Brian had gotten married to the mother of his child, Christine Verhoeven, right before the new year, which seemed very odd since he had parted ways with his former girlfriend just a few weeks before the celebration. Concerned, Michelle finally went to the police and reported her sister missing, suspecting that Ivon had not gone to Costa Rica. An official inquiry sent to Panama confirmed her fears. It was definitively established that Ivon Baldelli had not left the country. Valenzuela then turned to her cousin, a programmer, to help trace the IP address from which Ivon's messages were sent, determining their actual origin. It turned out the emails supposedly sent by Ivon from Costa Rica in December were actually sent from Dana Point, California, where Brian was located. The same IP address was used for an email sent by Brian himself. With the situation becoming increasingly alarming, Michelle hurriedly informed the police about her discovery. Valenzuela reached out to the FBI and the State Department, sharing her suspicions that Brian had harmed her sister in Panama, and then continued to send messages from her phone and email, pretending to be her for about a month. However, there was not enough solid evidence at the time to arrest him, so law enforcement could only interview him and continue gathering proof of his guilt. It was revealed that Brian had proposed to Christine while still in Panama with Ivon. He promised Verhoeven that he would soon return. They would get married and raise their daughter together. Moreover, Christine was unaware that her child's father had gone to the island with another woman, as he had told her he was there on business. The family's own investigation. 2 months after the woman's disappearance, her sister and niece personally flew to Panama. There, they sought the expertise of Don Winter, a former U.S. intelligence officer turned investigator, specializing in locating missing U.S. citizens. They shared the story of Ivon's disappearance and the version of events provided by Brian. Winter, after listening to them, immediately expressed concern that the chances of Ivon being alive were slim. With vast experience in such investigations and leveraging his connections, Winter decided to put pressure on the Panamanian government and publicize the case, turning the disappearance of an American woman into international news. A press conference was also organized with the participation of Ivon's family members. Later, Ivon's father, stepmother, brother, and several other relatives and close friends arrived in Panama to join the search and assist the investigation. Together, they went to the tropical island of Caramero, combing it thoroughly, yet they found no trace of Baldelli. Their search efforts were hampered by dense undergrowth and swampy marshes teeming with wildlife. In addition, the family questioned the island's residents about how well they knew Brian and Ivon and what they could say about them. It turned out that the couple had recently been heavily indulging in alcoholic beverages and were frequently involved in loud disputes, unconcerned about those around them. Almost daily, they were seen in bars drinking alcohol and having heated arguments. Furthermore, people began to notice bruises and scratches on Ivon's face and body. She almost never took off her sunglasses, seemingly to hide the bruises under her eyes. The landlord of the house the couple had rented confirmed that neighbors regularly complained about the noise, screams, and cursing coming from their residence. Simultaneously, FBI agents brought a special team of divers to the island to scour the waters around it for any potential evidence or remains of the missing woman. Unfortunately, these searches too did not yield any success. The prime suspect and the first solid evidence. From the outset, Ryan was the prime suspect in the case, but there was nothing concrete to charge him with. He denied any involvement, consistently recounting the same story about his ex-partner running off with another man. It wasn't until September 21, 2012 that Brimmager was finally interrogated, and a search was conducted in his home. At the time, his wife, Christine, was at work, while Brian was unemployed, staying at home with their child and indulging in his favorite pastime, playing golf. Initially, he appeared confident, repeating that Ivon had left him after finding out about his child with another woman. However, he became visibly nervous when the police mentioned that the last messages sent in Ivon's name came from his area and expressed interest in examining the laptop found on his table. The seized laptop turned out to belong to Ivon, with messages sent from it after she supposedly fled. A photo of the missing woman with a bruise under her eye was found on the computer, as well as a screenshot of a conversation from November, where Brian and Christine discussed their ongoing affair and shared daughter, presumably how Baldelli learned about them. Moreover, the laptop search history from November 26, 2011 contained queries such as how to clean blood and how to remove blood from a mattress. These pieces of evidence were significant but circumstantial since neither a body nor a mattress with bloodstains was found. The fact that Brian had been sending messages pretending to be Ivon didn't definitively prove him guilty. Soon, Don Winter discovered that before leaving Panama, Brimmager had sold a machete he owned. In an online conversation with a potential buyer, he joked that he had used the weapon just once to finish off a stripper. The joke was macabre, prompting authorities to track down the new owner of the machete and seize the blade for examination, which initially revealed nothing conclusive. The long-awaited arrest. The police overlooked another crucial detail, Yvonne's bank card, which Brian used after her disappearance. To add credibility to his story, before returning to the States, he decided to make a trip to Costa Rica and use the missing woman's card a couple of times, creating the illusion that she had indeed fled to that country. He paid for his tickets in cash and withdrew money from different locations in San Jose, draining the card before discarding it. However, Brimmager failed to consider that he was captured on surveillance cameras at the ATMs. It wasn't until July 2013, a year and a half after the woman's disappearance, that her relatives, armed with all the evidence gathered by the police, FBI agents, and Don Winter, finally managed to secure Brian's arrest. Initially, he was detained on charges of making false statements and obstructing the investigation as there was nothing more substantial to charge him with at that time. By then, he had become a father for the second time. Christine had given birth to a son just a week before his arrest. Authorities attempted to engage the suspect in a candid conversation, offering him a chance to confess to the crime and disclose the location of the body, but Brian consistently denied any wrongdoing. His lawyer also insisted on the absence of a body or direct evidence, proving Yvonne's demise and Brian's involvement in it. The gruesome discovery in the swamp. Just 2 months after Brimmager's arrest, a significant breakthrough occurred in the case. On the island of Carinaro, a worker taking a shortcut wandered into the swampy underbrush and spotted an army backpack barely visible above the water's surface. Driven by curiosity and hoping to find something valuable or useful inside, he looked in the bag only to recoil in horror at the sight of a human skull staring back at him. He immediately reported his find to the police, and responding officers took the backpack for examination. Inside were fragments of a human body along with the remains of 2 small dogs. The remains had been chopped up, placed in the bag, and discarded in a location where it was assumed they would never be found. DNA testing confirmed that the human remains belonged to Yvonne, although limbs were missing. Pathologists also determined that she had been brutally beaten before her demise with a broken nose, cheekbone, and several missing teeth. The demise of the dogs was probably orchestrated to lend credence to the narrative, as it seemed implausible that she would willingly leave behind her cherished pets on the island, suggesting a scenario where they were eliminated and laid to rest alongside their owner. When the chop marks found on the victim's bones were matched with the blade of the machete, there was no doubt. The body had been dismembered using this weapon, as each blade has its own signature, akin to a person's fingerprints. With this evidence, Brian was formally charged with murder, dismemberment, and concealing a crime. The trial and verdict. In early 2014, Michelle Valenzuela was diagnosed with an advanced stage of aggressive cancer. She had been so consumed by the investigation into her sister's case that she neglected her deteriorating health, postponing visits to the doctor. After undergoing intensive treatment for about 6 months and realizing it was in vain, she decided to dedicate the last months of her life to seeking justice for her sister. In September 2014, when doctors told Michelle she had only a few weeks left, she declared that although she was losing her battle with the disease, she would continue to fight for her sister until her last breath. Choosing to make her testimony in front of Brian, she detailed everything she knew and submitted all their correspondence with Yvonne to the court. She meticulously described Brian's actions after her sister's disappearance and then fainted from weakness. Michelle passed away 3 days later. The prosecution argued that on the evening of November 26th, following another argument with Yvonne, when she discovered Brian's communications with Christine, Brian, in a fit of rage and under the influence of alcohol, assaulted Ivon and then fatally stabbed her. He then dismembered her body in the bathtub using a machete, also using it to take the live Ivon's beloved dogs and place the remains in his military backpack. The limbs that didn't fit in the bag were dumped in the ocean, dropped off a rocky cliff early in the morning along with the blood-stained mattress. Brian carried the backpack deep into the island and submerged it in a swamp. For the next few weeks, he continued living in the same coastal house, meticulously erasing any evidence of the crime. He told everyone on the island a story about his flighty girlfriend leaving him for a new lover, a story that sounded convincing enough that locals sympathized with Brian. And he even managed to find a new girlfriend, Nicole Powell, who comforted him for a few weeks until his departure to the U.S. However, at the trial, Nicole testified against Brian, accusing him of lying and cruelty. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Brian was forced to admit his guilt, but insisted that it was self-defense, claiming Ivon had first attacked him with a knife, which he then used against her. He claimed all subsequent actions were carried out in the state of shock, asserting he didn't remember dismembering and packing the body, taking the lives of the dogs, and so forth. However, his internet searches and attempts to eliminate evidence spoke to his full awareness and attempts to fabricate a story to justify Ivon's absence. In the spring of 2016, Brian was found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to only 26 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 2035. His service in the Marines was considered during sentencing, allowing him to avoid a life sentence. Lastly, Brian's wife, Christine Verhoeven, stated she still believed in her husband's innocence and would support him no matter what. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.